Good morning, everybody, or actually good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Today is an exciting episode because today we're going to be introducing a new segment. So again, joining me is my co-host, Micah Current. How are you doing today, Micah?
Good, man. How are you?
Um, well, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see my hair looks very wet. And I just want to let people know it's because I got out of the shower probably about 15 minutes before recording, but it's also super hot, so it could just be sweat. So I just want to let everyone know it's not me sweating a bunch, it's me getting out of the
You
shower.
also told me that it was like 80 degrees in your apartment.
It is. And my wife had the AC off. So I just before we record, I went and shut the windows and turned it back on. Yeah, I could feel the coolness now. So I'm like, all right, we're getting there. Yep. But marriage. so so we're gonna start this new segment, Micah, called What's the Craziest Thing You've Ever Experienced? It could be anything that you've heard, you read, something you witnessed. And so yeah, so this week, or technically since we're recording on Monday, it'd be last week, but what was the craziest thing you experienced this week?
Um, I was trying to think about this because you texted me yesterday and I was kind of thinking over it, but I was like, well, what we're going to be talking about today is transitions in ministry. And I'm going through a transition currently, and just like you are, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be making a transition to another church. And I haven't seen the lead pastor of the church that I'm currently at for a couple of weeks. He had vacation. He and his wife went on a cruise for 2 weeks. So like it's been 3-4 weeks since I've seen him in person or talked to him. And so um I know that he knew that I was making that change and that we were, getting ready to transition out of that ministry into another. And he came up to me yesterday. I led worship at the church yesterday. Normally I run production and the communication side of things, but I led worship because the worship leader was out this weekend. And he came up to me 5 minutes before service and he was like, "So do you want me to tell the church that you're leaving?" 5 minutes before service.
Jeez.
And I was like, I mean, sure, but here was my exact response. I'm like, well, you're the pastor. You can, I'm like, you can make that choice. I don't, it's not going to change my mind and it's not going to change the outcome of this scenario. But he came up to me about 5 minutes before service and was like, "Do you want me to tell the church today or is that okay?" I'm like, Go ahead. Yeah, that's fine. It's totally fine." So yeah, that was one of the things. I mean, I've had a ton of things happen. Um, Probably too much drama for this show. So, what about you, Scott? That was on the more tamer side of things, I think.
Wow, that's crazy. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about yeah, we'll talk a little bit about it, but yeah. I mean, I don't oh man. I don't
I'd say the craziest thing that I've heard about you this week is the fact that you're sitting in your apartment with the air conditioning off.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
I think when it talks about transitions, I think that's weird, but I also think that's the random fact that 5 minutes before service is about to start, you're having that conversation. I feel like even if a pastor wanted to just kind of double check, at least have a plan. Hey, we're going to announce that you're leaving. If you want to, if you and your wife want to, stand by the back doors and greet people and talk to people, or blah blah blah, or hey, we're going to set up a going away thing later, and kind of have it just like, oh hey, by the way, like
I've noticed that at smaller churches with pastors that have been there a long time. That seems to be a common thread
hmm.
where they will wait until the last minute to do or make a decision, come up to you 4 to 5 minutes before service and say, "Hey, by the way, we're doing this," or um, yeah,
Hmm.
it's like we talked about a couple of weeks ago in the episode that we were talking about just kind of politics in the pulpit, and how the same pastor that I'm referring to now just got up that Sunday and said he was going to throw us a curveball and didn't even preach the sermon that he gave us. So, yeah,
Crazy.
I think it's common
So,
in smaller situations.
so here's the craziest thing that I experienced this week. So I only have like about a week left working at the bakery before I make my transition out of the state and back to my home state of Ohio to working at a church job in Columbus. So occasionally, since I'm by a loud mixer, I usually have my earplugs in, and I'm listening to podcasts, kind of catching up on stuff. So I was listening to the Holy Post podcast. It's episode 513. And usually they have like something where they talk about random things, usually animals, or sometimes they talk about butt news. Like they have a segment called Butt News. So don't ask me why. I don't know why that is a thing. But one of the conversations is, and this is a term I've never heard before in my life. So that's why it's crazy. But Micah, have you ever heard of the term uh, sologamy?
No.
Polygamy. Which you would think, like, my first reaction is like, okay, like ogamy, like kind of like polygamy or anything like that. So I'm thinking it's just like two slugs that like love each other. Like that's what I was thinking. No, sologamy is when a person, a human being, wants to marry themselves. Just your reaction was priceless. That's all I needed. So I'm listening to this conversation and I'm thinking, there's a couple of things I'm thinking of. A, how narcissistic must you be that you think, you know what? I'm so good looking. I'm such a big catch that I don't need anyone else in my life. I just want to marry myself.
I can think of a couple people.
Well, and actually, one of the probably the funniest things is that they mentioned that there was a Brazilian supermodel that married herself, and then 3 days later got a divorce from herself. And then one of the comments, one of the things which was the funniest thing, I busted live goes, did they meet someone new? They didn't want to like cheat on themselves, so they got a divorce from themselves. But I'm like, that's insane. It's insane. And for me, it's insane for a couple reasons. A, for the reason I just gave about, how narcissistic must you be that you want to marry yourself. But B, when I think about the sanctity of marriage and the idea of having a suitable partner. And when I think about suitable partner, I'm usually, as much as we would like someone who's exactly like you in some ways, having someone who's kind of different than you is a blessing because they can kind of see your blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like if you're just so focused on me, and plus a lot of this is happening overseas, I don't really see. Of course, we're not seeing this in America, but even if we started to see this in America, or there was a law passed that said, okay, you can marry yourself. I mean, isn't that just adding to just our individualistic culture already?
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that's that's insane. Like that's crazy. Like I don't know. Like that is absolutely the strangest thing I've heard this week was the term sologamy and what it means.
Um, do you watch America's Got Talent?
I do not know.
So my wife and I just watch the auditions. We don't watch the actual show once they get past the auditions, but the auditions are probably the best part of the whole show. But a couple of over the weekend we watched one of the auditions episodes, and there was a guy who went up to audition. I don't know if he was a magician. It really doesn't matter what his talent was in this moment, but he talked about his partners. And so he was apparently married to somebody and they had a girlfriend together. But I forget the term that they used. And I had never heard it before. My wife was like, "What?" But apparently was married and then they had a girlfriend. So they shared a girlfriend together. But there's a term for it.
Is it? It's not polygamy, is it? Because poly means more than one.
Domestic.
Go
Go to the Google.
to the Google. Or polymorous.
That's it.
Polymorous. Yeah. It's characterized by
No, polyamorous or whatever, right?
yeah, polyamorous. That's it. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, to kind of piggyback off what you said with the weirdest thing, like I heard that and I was like, what? But I think. Do you remember the band Breaking Benjamin?
I do, yes.
Yeah, one of their albums was called Polyamorous. I don't know why I remember that, but that was, that was college. That was college.
Yeah, no joke. So moving, and again, this has been the craziest things we've heard this week. Yeah. Again, we don't have like a little like transitional segue there,
I could
but
write one. I could write one.
there you go. Let's write one, and then maybe next episode we'll throw it in there.
We'll
How
throw
about
the Price is Rights music in there.
da-da-da? Someone singing the lyrics to the Price Right thing. What's the craziest thing you ever heard? That's the clock kicking in right now, folks.
Scott, my friend, I think the heat's really getting to you.
It is. Like now, now my hair still looks wet and it's dry. So definitely, this is now we went from shower to sweat
To dry.
to dry. So, all right. So on this episode, we're going to be talking about transitions, especially kind of transitions in ministry. And I know throughout a couple of episodes back, or actually probably spread throughout the episodes, we've talked about me transitioning out of Virginia, even kind of not taking, pastoring a non-Church of God church as an associate. And Micah, you've talked about, at least, I don't know if you talked about on the show about how you're transitioning to be a worship leader, I believe at a Nazarene church. So
Yep.
so
Yep.
there's a lot of transitions. So one of the questions that always comes to mind is, what is the most exciting thing about transitioning from one ministry to the next?
Just doing something new, I think. I mean,
Hmm.
it it can be rewarding making that switch because you may have been hurt. The end of your time at another opportunity,
Hmm.
ministry wise, may have not ended well. You might have felt burnt out. You may have walked away from ministry for a season. Um, I think it's important that you have that break in between those seasons and chapters of your ministry career. Um, but yeah, I think it. Well, yeah, and then the most exciting thing I think would be just to see how other ministries do things differently. Um, and may align with what you believe and may align with how you would like to do things. Maybe, for example, you're going from a church of 50 to a church of, I don't know, 500, 600 people, and they seem to run things more smoothly than they would in a smaller church, and they have multiple staff members, and um, people have their lanes that they serve in, whether it's children's or student ministry or worship ministry, tech, creative, lead pastor, executive pastor, et cetera, et cetera. And in larger situations, you get a chance to thrive more in the area that you're called to instead of having to focus and divvy up all your responsibilities into multiple areas of ministry. So it's exciting to see just how things are done in another situation. What about you?
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said. I think the other thing that's I think exciting for me is just taking everything you've learned from your previous experience, both the good, the bad, the ugly, and just kind of taking some of the valuable nuggets, lessons you've learned, and just kind of implement that into your new ministry.
And I said this on other episodes, Scott, but like I had a pastor tell me years ago to love the people and take your time. So like when you go into a new situation, just sit back, listen. It's important to have that balance of like, yes, you want to dive in head first and really learn the ropes of the new ministry that you're serving and be a part of. But at the same time, you need to just kind of, you don't want to go in there and, flipping chairs and painting the whole building and, making all these abrupt changes because that could backfire in your face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think a lot of it, and I think a lot, even with that, I think a lot of it also has to do with the personality of the leader that's coming in
Mm-hmm.
to the position. I also think it also has to do with kind of the culture that you're going into too, because if you have a healthy church culture and you have a leader that comes in who's very, okay, I have a vision, let's go, let's do things, but at the same time, it's also very good at having that balance of, I'm going to make some of these changes, but at the same time, I'm really going to get to know the people that I'm serving, or the families that I'm a part of, or the kids that I'm going to be ministering to. And I think, you can go and make some changes, but there has to be a balance. If you just go in there all like, okay, we're changing this, and you have no relationship with anybody in that church, then you're really going to be having a hard go at it. Yeah, and I think for me, the other exciting thing is kind of like to just kind of communicate what you've already said, is that since I'm going to be moving into a whole different structure, where I think Church of God, as far as how they run things, as far as within the local church, is very laid back, kind of very low in certain terms. Like, they have a sense of order, but not really. It's just, we're going to do a church service. Like, no one's wearing robes. No one has like a specific like order of how they do things. And, it's not like explicitly written out and this is the way we do it, where, within the UMC, they have a specific way of doing things. Their clergy wear robes. Sometimes they have, I don't know what they're called, but they have kids that are also wearing robe, and they're lighting the candles on the Lord's table. So they're kind of,
There's a sense of tradition there.
a sense of tradition. So very high tradition, where I think the Church of God, very low tradition, unless their high tradition is their heritage hymns, which is really big in the Church of God. We got to sing our heritage hymns, which we've talked about that before. So obviously there's some things that are exciting about transitioning from one ministry to the next, but what's most challenging? What's the most thing that kind of gives you anxiety, or kind of makes you sweat a little bit with this transition to a new ministry?
Just the nerves of getting hurt again, the nerves of going through some of the same hurt and anxiety, stress that goes along with ministry. Just being afraid to like get too involved and get too attached again, because we've talked about it in other episodes, because you like basically you uproot your life to go to another place, and it's like making new friends. It's like going from place to place to place, and most people don't understand that, but we talked about that in the Preacher's Kid episode. But like it's the same for pastors, because you're literally uprooting your life, you're uprooting your family's life, you're going to a new place in hopes that it's going to work and you're going to succeed in a new ministry and a new venture. I think over the years I've learned, and I said it in the last question that you asked, but really getting to know people and what they do, know their work style, know their workflow, and then really get to know your volunteers and the people that are going to be serving around you, and really invest in them early on, and create those relationships. And that's something that I've learned and continue to have to work on. Like, how are you really doing? What can I do to make your life easier? Just really being mindful of what you're going into. And if your heart's desire is to stay at a place long term, to really establish those relationships early, whether that's with staff or volunteers, making sure your family's happy where you're at, where you're serving. And if you're in it for the long haul, which we should be, just take your time and realize it's not a race. I've been in some ministries where it's the opposite, where they want you to hit the ground running and they want stuff done yesterday. And it's like, I just got here. So, it's challenging. And I know that, we haven't really talked about our transitions in detail, but like I led worship at the church I'm serving at yesterday, and I went and stopped by the Nazarene church that we're going to be transitioning to in a couple of weeks. Just to see them at, because the service I played and led for yesterday started earlier. So we were able to go to the other church, and we went out to lunch with the pastor and some other folks that are going to be on the staff with us. And just shared my heart, and that I was pretty anxious about diving into another ministry season just because of the hurt that we've experienced over the last couple of years. And there's been healing and reconciliation and all those things, but like there's still those emotional triggers and anxiety that goes along with, am I good enough? Is this going to be okay? 6 months from now, are we still going to be happy that I'm here? Are you going to let me do my job? Are we going to be able to make those changes that you hired me to do? Which are all legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
So yeah, um, I would love to get Pastor John on here, and in a future episode, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday, Scott. But like, I've never met a more humble man of God than Pastor John Young, and I think part of his story and his experience is that he's experienced being in a healthy church of 400 people. He's experienced being in a church of 50. He's experienced being in a church of 200 people, and the church split right down the middle and 100 people left, and he stayed after the church split. And so when he hired me and he asked me if I wanted to come, he was like, we're not perfect and we love everybody. And I've just never felt the legitimacy. So even with all that said, I still have the anxiety, have the nervousness that goes along with any transition of moving and the crazy thing is, Scott, like I can walk 2 minutes that way and that's where the church is, right? Whereas I'm driving 10 minutes. It's like the quickest commute to any church that I've ever worked at. And so it's just amazing. There's so much that goes along with that because if you would have asked me the same question 2 years ago, I would have probably told you I'm not doing this anymore. Right? Yeah. Because it was just easier to walk away and not be engrossed in ministry because it's not healthy.
Yeah. And I
had to get to a healthy place to even make that decision today.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of been the consensus for a lot of things. Like even when, I was, again, like I told you, I was listening to a bunch of podcasts and I heard one where they had Dave Kinnaman from Barna Group on, just giving statistics, and they talked about ministers, or basically any minister, whatever, lead, associate, worship, whatever, leaving churches. And a big percentage of it was just, the occasional, I feel burned out. But also some of it just feels like I'm just not content with kind of the culture in the church anymore. It's just become a very unhealthy place. Yeah. So I think that's very telling of what has happened within the last 2 to 3 years, is that the reason why we've seen such a mass exodus of ministers either leaving the church for good, or taking this season where they're not jumping right into the next ministry, or them who leave one place and go to another. I think the big thing has been because they've been to an unhealthy place. And that's always the big thing, or we like to call the honeymoon stage, is when a minister goes to a new church, there is kind of that little bit of a bubble where it's like, oh, everyone's very excited that they have a new minister now, and everyone's all happy. And then once that phase is over, depending on how long that phase is, it can be very trying. And then you can really kind of get the rose-colored goggles off and really see what you have and go, ooh, this is going to be a lot of work. Which, kind of your thing with me talking to the pastor at the church I'm transitioning to, we were talking about stuff, and she kind of mentioned some of the challenges that she's facing as the lead, and some of the things that have happened in the past that she's trying to cause some healing or reconciliation for. And she even made the comment like, you didn't think you're coming to serve at a easy church, did you? And it was like, I wasn't expecting it, but at least the fact that she knows, hey, there's some challenges. There's some things.
And most pastors, Scott, want to ignore that.
Oh yeah.
And be very passive.
They're very passive, or like, especially like in a small church. Like I remember when I came down here to Virginia, I would ask them hard-hitting questions because I wanted to, and not necessarily, I want to know about all your skeletons in your closet so then I can leave. It was more of, I want to know about the skeletons in your closet so that I can know what I'm stepping into and what are some things that is going to prepare me to kind of do the relational, the mentoring, and even some of the healing work that needs to be done to really see this church grow and be able to make some of the changes. And I mean, I was told, oh no, things are great, things are wonderful, things are, we have a really good group of people here. We in and everything else. And it's like, okay. And again, this was like my second pastorate. So I didn't know any better. And then I walk in, and then sure enough, 3 months in, I'm already seeing the problems and the red flags. And it's like, these were things that you guys should have explicitly communicated to me. And it just kept getting worse as each year there's more stuff. It was like, once I felt like I cleaned out one closet, there was more closets that I had to clean out. So, but yeah, I would say the most challenging thing is, I agree with everything you said. I think one of the big things is, how does this church, what is the, how, I guess, how deep is the church's grace culture? Because when you walk into a new position, there's always going to be some challenges. And there's always going to be some things that you may not know. It may be a whole different work culture, and you may not know what you need to do. And I mean, we had Jordan on our show on the Pastor Kids episode, but I remember when he transitioned out to Oklahoma, there was a couple things where, the lead pastor said, oh, hey, did you do this yet? And he's like, oh, no. He goes, well, you need to do this ahead of time. So then that way people can, people want to be able to plan their vacation around youth events. So the quicker you get it out and the more futuristically you're setting these dates, the more you're going to have a bigger response to these things. And that thing's okay. Like, he didn't know that because, again, that's something that's a more of a culture thing of being in a larger church that he didn't know. Plus, it could be his personality too, because I see that look.
No. I actually just posted on my Facebook social media what you just said. I quoted what you just said. How deep is the church's grace culture? Because that is a profound thing, man, that people don't talk about.
Book. How deep is the church? Well, I mean, but I'm serious.
And you got credit. You got credit for that. I tagged you in it, and I quoted you. So like, yes, 100%.
You got to listen to this episode. But yeah, I mean, but here's the thing about grace culture, because grace culture is two things. First of all, what is the leadership doing to create that culture? And the leadership is, if you had a leadership ahead of you that it was very, very corporate driven, and if you made a mistake, you were punished, you may have been demoted, you may have been kind of got your hand slapped, but in a loving way, like, okay, like, you really screwed up, but we still love you because Jesus loves you, like kind of like that, backhand compliment sort of thing. But if you have something where it's like, hey, here's how we do things. Because there's a couple of times where I'm even asking questions like, hey, how do you do this? And even have a meeting with my pastor tomorrow, and I'm going to be like saying, hey, here's some other questions. Because again, I want to make sure that when I come in, it's very smooth. I don't want to come in and then people go, man, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. But at the same time, I'm coming into a different culture. So if the grace culture within this, if the grace culture is deep, then even when I have these hiccups, even when I have these missteps in ministry, I'm able to say, hey, that's okay. You're new. We're not expecting you to be the miracle worker. We're not expecting you to raise the dead and heal the lame on your very first day on the job. You have to try to get into this. So, and it's like what you said, if you can take time to love people and build those relationships first, then I think if you're starting on that foot first, then already you're kind of creating a grace culture. Because if someone, even if your volunteers mess up, and by mess up saying, like, in a meeting you say, hey, can you go and check the price of this curriculum? Or, hey, we're going to be doing this big kids event, can you go get sponsors from the community? And you have a meeting and you go, hey, were you able to do it? And they said, oh no, I forgot, blah blah blah. Either A, I could, as a leader, I could say, like, this is very important. We only have like 3 weeks out and we have no sponsors. Like, what the heck are you doing? And I could go like that and really cause a lot of guilt and shame. Or I can say, that's okay. Do you need help? Would it be better if instead of you taking this on your own, would it be better if we had a couple other people to kind of help in this endeavor? So then that pressure is off your shoulders with everything else you're having going on in your normal lives. Because again, you don't live at the church. Your family doesn't live at the church. You have a job.
They, they don't.
They don't. And I think that's kind of where grace culture comes. You realize that, hey, other people have their issues. Some people may be dealing with stuff that either they are confessing to the body, in order for the body to assist and help and to bring healing to that, or they're dealing with it silently because they don't want to bring it up to a church, mainly because they may have been hurt in the past, or maybe the culture inside the church is not so healthy that you don't want to bear your burdens to one another. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think for me, it has to be, how deep is the grace culture? And especially if you're transitioning, I think, and you know that there isn't a good grace culture, then that's something that as a pastor, you have to begin to set and begin to dig that well as deep as you can. So then that way, if that's being modeled by how you're treating your board, your staff, the people who are underneath you, then that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the entire congregation on how they deal with some of those transitional missteps. So we've talked about the exciting things about transitioning, the most challenging things. So how does a leader make a smooth transition from one ministry to another? So Mike, what are you doing right now that's trying to make this transition smooth? What are you doing on your end that's trying to make the transition smooth for you?
Yeah. So the church I'm at is a pretty small situation and it's a pretty small situation, and they don't have a lot of volunteers. So what I've tried to do, and just to be clear, like I started this church in February as a contracted consultant. I didn't go in as a staff member, as somebody who was going to be there long term, and that was just kind of what we knew and prayed about going in. And so my goal really going in was to get them set up for a win, as far as like, we revamped their website. I redid their website. They had no social media presence. We got their social media, to the point where they were posting every single day. We're posting sermon clips, and we've started a YouTube page for them. Like, all of these things that they didn't have before. And so what I've done to help with that is create those systems, document those systems, and then give those volunteers that are still going to be there after my departure those things in writing and digital, so that they can function smoothly after I transition out.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to find, though, they've been very graceful and very understanding of our hearts and our willingness to want to transition out, and they have been very accepting of that. I've been in places where it's not been so accepting, like you resign and it's just super toxic, and they want you to get out of there, and you want to get out of there. So like, even if you set them up for a win and do the things that, like I've stated previously, they may or may not even use those things, or they may or may not just throw away everything you've done the day after you left. So in good conscience, my wife and I have always in our ministry used the mantra, leave the place better than you found it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's setting them up for a win, leaving passwords, leaving information for contact for vendors, have operating systems in place, documents in place to show people how you do things, like edit website, edit social media, create graphics, resources that you use to create graphics or sermon branding or anything like that. Having that stuff written down is just super important. And even if they don't use it once you leave, at least you know that you've done your due diligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I would say as far as the leader making a smooth transition, again, I'm kind of in a different situation because I'm not leaving a church per se. I've been outside of the church for about a year now since I resigned. So I'm kind of just transitioning in. And I think the big thing that's helped is there's been times where my team or the team that's kind of helping planning these family ministry events and talking about all these different things, they're like, you don't have to be in these meetings, but we want to make you aware that these meetings are happening. And I've been in every single meeting except the last week's, which got canceled. But if it didn't get canceled, I was still on vacation. So I said, that's the only meeting I'm going to miss. And even the team was like, we're just very thankful that you're able to be in these meetings and that we're able to talk with you and get to know you through having these meetings.
Mhm.
So, just kind of, even though I'm not officially there, I'm kind of being a part. And then even the week before I actually move into the parsonage that they have for me, that Tuesday, they're having a youth like kayak trip. And there's a part of me that's like, well, I'm already in Ohio. I'm gonna be living in Cleveland at my father-in-law's house and staying there. And it's like, and I'm kind of thinking like, I don't have anything to do really because everything's going to be kind of loaded up in a truck already and just waiting a couple days before we can actually officially move in. Like maybe I'll drive my 2 hours down to Columbus and go on a kayaking trip, and just kind of, wouldn't be the person in charge, but I just would be there to minister to get to know the teens and everything else. And it's like, I even told my wife about it, and she goes, "Well, I want to go too." Like she was kayaking as well. So it's like, well, hey, since we're up in Ohio with family, let's have your mom, your dad, or my parents watch the kids. We're going to go down to Columbus and kayak and maybe get our license changed too from Virginia to Ohio license. So take care of some business while we're down there as well. So I think that's kind of a thing where I think it kind of makes smooth transition that it's not like I'm not going to do anything and then I'm there. It's like you're just constantly having those conversations. You're constantly meeting with a small percentage or like kind of like your 10% of people that you're going to be ministering to and kind of go, okay, here we go. Here's kind of how the transition is going to be smooth. And I think that's really what makes a smooth transition on the leader side who's transitioning. Uh, but how does the church help assist in these smooth transitions? What can the church do to kind of make things as smooth as possible for the transition for the pastor to come in?
Now, to clarify, is it for the people? So is it for you coming into a situation or leaving a situation? Because it can be.
I'm going to say, for me, I'm thinking as you're transitioning into a ministry. So I think my big thing is going into it. So not out, but in. And
Got
what
it.
can do? I mean, if you want to hit both, you can. But I think for the purpose of me thinking when I wrote these questions is about if I'm going into a church, what can
Got it.
that church do to make
Um, I yes. So it's um I said it in the last segment or last question, just setting you up for a win is really important. And I know for me it can be very overwhelming at times to go into a new situation. Um and just extending again the grace culture that you referenced earlier for anybody that's transitioning into a new ministry. I think that's really, really important. So yeah, just patience, grace, offering to help people. Uh and again, I think that goes along with getting to know people once you start in a new assignment. Like really just going out of your way, taking your volunteers out to lunch, grabbing a cup of coffee, um, just learning about how they serve the ministry that you're going to be serving because it's a partnership. And so uh I don't know, man. What do you think? Like I think that you could look at it a number of ways. You can look at it from a like okay, if you're super introverted and you need your batteries recharged and you walk into a place and it's just super overwhelming and it's just like you've just moved your family to a brand new place and it's almost like I need time to breathe. Right. And then but at the same time they want you to hit the ground running. So there's a couple of ways you could look at that. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's hard for a church to understand someone's personality if they're an extrovert or introvert. So I think a lot of times if you're an introvert by nature and someone's just constantly and the whole body is like smothering you and you're just like, ah, like I think and I think this is where grace culture kind of comes back in too. If you realize, man, if you're reading the room and you're like, okay, this pastor's feeling super uncomfortable, maybe they're introverted. Let's back up a little bit. I think the other thing is just care. Like really, because churches can only do so much stuff. If you have a larger church, maybe they're able to help financially with like moving expenses. Maybe they're able to help with, right when you get there, give you a whole bunch of volunteers to help you unpack or be able to provide meals for you. I know some churches may not have that luxury. Some churches, the only thing they may be able to do is help you unload, and that's about it. And maybe have a dinner on their first Sunday, have a dinner afterwards just to say, hey, we're so excited for you to be here. But I think it all boils down to care. Like, do you truly care about this individual, this pastoral family that is coming in to be your new shepherds? And if you do truly care about them, then it's not just providing resources for them, but it's basically also praying for them. It's also about, making, checking up on them, loving them, just saying, hey, just wanted to call. Is it okay if I stop by and drop off some soup or drop off something for you? And just really have that time of letting them love you. But I think on the same way is for the person who's in charge, also accepting those things too. Um, and also I think another thing is also to recognize boundaries too. If a pastor's laying down certain boundaries, like, hey, I don't want 50 people dropping off dinners on Monday because I don't have the room in my refrigerator to store 50 meals. Like, say, hey, so and so's bringing this food, is bringing me something on Monday. These three people are bringing me breakfast, lunch, and dinner. How about you bring it on Tuesday? Would that work for you? So then that way we can kind of, because again, our fridge is full and our hearts are full and our fridge is full. So if we can space that out a little bit, that would be great. Um, yeah, so I think, how does the church help assist in these smooth transitions? I think it just has to do with care and really, as a body and even as an individual in that body, what things can I do to show care? Maybe someone's not good at showing their care by talking with them or talking to you in person because they're super introverted, but maybe they'll send a card and saying, hey, Pastor Scott, we're so glad that you're here. We appreciate you. We're praying for you. I mean, I have literally boxes in my house, in our apartment, of every single card I have received from church members. And it's good because sometimes I'll go through them and I read them, and it's just very uplifting seeing people from Cortland, seeing people in Stanton, seeing, I'll probably get some cards and stuff from people when I'm in Bexley. And I think that's going to, that's always going to really show how much people care. And it's going to kind of, again, help me be in the right focus that these people care about me and I care about serving them and loving them. So it's kind of that duality of care between the person who's transitioning into their a specific ministry at a church and the congregation showing that same love and care to the pastoral family that's coming in.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah. So anything else that we haven't covered about transitions? I mean, I feel like we've kind of hit the foundation or the four pillars, I guess, Is there anything else about transitions that we need to discuss?
I mean, I guess maybe we could both share what we're doing, I guess, and like how we're doing in the moment and how we're feeling about those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, especially being, Church of God guys who are ordained in Church of God going to a completely different denomination, if you want to call it that, or ordinance or church or style of church or um, yeah. So and the transition, as it's happening in real time. So like I said, we over the last couple of years have really had a heart for consulting, coaching, and leading churches into the 21st century. I'm using that term lightly because of just live streaming and the need for live streaming. And back in February, a friend of mine who's leading worship at the church that we're at now, he called me and said, "Hey, I really have a need for a person to run my tech. And would you and your wife consider praying about that?" And I was like, "Sure." So we came in, we knew it wasn't going to be long term, but we also knew that they needed some help in reference to their website. For example, their website was 3 years old and had never been touched in the last 3 years. And so we did that. We updated their social, created the YouTube page, did some welcome videos, just really got them, created a brand for them, created new logos, XYZ. So 2 years ago, I was working at a church here in this area and had transitioned out because it was a part-time role. A friend of mine who I was on staff with at that church is now going to be the executive pastor at the church that we're going to. And she reached out and said, "Hey, are you interested in leading worship? We need somebody to fill in." And this was back in July. I'm sorry, in June. And I was like, "Sure, I'll be willing to fill in." And so I led. And after the service, we just met with the pastor and he was like, "We really have a need for a worship leader. Would you be interested?" And I'm like, thanks, but no thanks. I'm really not, not really looking for that right now in my life. But like, they just kept, they didn't push, but they, we just kept meeting. And so we continued to have conversations and we just really felt at peace about it. And so we had lunch with the pastor and his wife, and we just said, "Hey, we really feel like God's calling us for this next season of our ministry, and would love to help the church here in any way that we can." So we let the church know last week that we were doing that. We gave our 2 weeks. This Sunday is going to be our last Sunday. Then we're going to take a couple Sundays off because we just haven't had time off in forever. So we're going to take 2 weeks off, and we're going to start in August as creative arts pastor at Trenton Grace Point Church in Trenton, which is where we live. It's a Nazarene church. Theologically, it's very, very close to Church of God Anderson, which is what you and I are affiliated with. And so we feel pretty comfortable about that situation. Had conversations about transitioning credentials, and we can do another podcast on that later. But like, I'm as of right now, I'm just going to keep my Church of God credentials because I worked pretty hard for those. And yeah, so we're excited. We're kind of nervous. We're excited, but like we said it earlier, Scott, but like my wife and I are like, we go into this church, and yes, there's some work that needs to be done. Yes, there's some things that we need to tackle, but like the people are so loving. And you talked about the grace culture earlier, and it's like my wife and I are kind of like waiting for the other foot to drop because like these people are so nice, and I'm like, why are these people so nice? Like, I'm not used to this. So I think it's just something that we're going to have to work on. And it's just amazing. And I've talked about Pastor John before, but we talked about salaries and things like that, and I'm not going to get into the numbers because they haven't really talked about that with me yet. But like, he, being the lead pastor, said he would be willing to give up salary so that we could come. Right. And so like, how amazing is that? And I'm like, "Pastor, you don't have to worry about that. I have a full-time job elsewhere, and I'm not worried about money because God provides." And yeah, it's the polar opposite of what I came from, where I was working in larger churches where pastors were making close to, if not 6 figures a year. Lead pastors were making close to 6 figures a year. And we're not willing to do the same thing that this man, who probably doesn't make half of what those guys are making, willing to give up his own salary so that he could hire staff to help his church move forward.
Yeah.
Like, that is a humble man of God. And so I was sold from that point. So what about you, Scott? Like, talk about I know that you were a lead pastor in Virginia and you're going to be transitioning to a UMC church.
Yeah. So very, very interesting. So so the transition for me is one of excitement and a little bit of nervousness too, because again, I'm going to be pastoring.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that's nervous.
Oh, it's the thing. I think even if I was transitioning to another Church of God church, I think I would still have nerves just because of the way things went down here. Like, you talk about loving people and people who are so kind and loving. And one thing, when I was my first pastorship in Cortland, Ohio, like that was my congregation. Very loving. Grace culture was deep, very biblical based. If there was some missteps I made in ministry, I could think of like a couple elders that would come and talk to me about it, and I would kind of say, hey, here's what's going on, and I would go and I would address it and build those bridges and move towards reconciliation, and things were great. And even when I left, they just continued to love on us, love on our family. They were sad that we were leaving, but they understood that, it was time for me to move on in ministry. And that was great, where my transition in and my transition out of the church in Virginia was just turbulence, lots of turbulence. So a lot of great things happened there, a lot of tragic things happened there. So going into this, talking about smooth transitions, it's like, okay, I'm a Church of God guy going into a UMC culture. Have a high theology, or have a high tradition as far as how they do things, but they're also kind of laid back too. It's a UMC church, but a lot of people that attend there do not have a Methodist background. Some of them have a Baptist background. Some of them have Catholic background. Some of them. So it's almost like a smorgasbord of different backgrounds within a UMC church. So it's like, okay. It's also in a very high suburban neighborhood, which terrifies me in some ways, because it's like, wow, it's very like Pleasantville kind of thing. Very Leave It to Beaver when you walk in there. It's like, oh, this is it. Even like when I tell people, oh, I'm moving to Columbus, like, oh, where? I'm like, east. Like, oh, this area. I'm like, no, Bexley. They're like, ooh, you're moving to Bexley, Mr. Big Time. And I'm thinking, what? Like, so there is a culture about the community that I'm moving into. So that's a little nerve-wracking to me. But, and then also, how does my view of the scriptures, how does that relate to the people that I'm serving? Because I'm going to be serving kids and youth and families, and kind of overseeing all those ministry and really recruiting volunteers to do that. And I'm also going to be helping with I can't think of it now, but there's a big thing that they do where it helps with that they do for 6 months out of the year, where they kind of have people, confirmation. I'm going to be doing confirmation, and that's something that's not a Church of God thing. So, and I even last conversation I had with my pastor, I'm like, I started asking questions about confirmation. Goes, don't you dare worry about confirmation right now. That's still a long ways off. We just want you to worry about getting settled and just kind of building those relationships. And that's the thing. Like, for me, I'm a workhorse. So
yeah,
I hit the feet running. So the fact that I was offered this job in like spring, and I'm not starting till almost like into summer, fall, like I'm chomping at the bit. Like, I'm like, man, I'm ready to go. But I also have to kind of put those boundaries in place and say, hey, I need to settle down too. So
how do you feel about that, Scott? Like, as far as the making that transition from Church of God to UMC and having to do things like confirmation? Do you feel uneasy about it? Do you feel okay about it?
I, here's the thing. I felt nervous about it until I talked to the person I'm replacing, because we had a meeting, and they even said with confirmation, the person before him, they did it this way. For him, it was more about getting the basics, like who is Jesus? What is baptism? What is communion? Like really go through the basics and not really work. I mean, occasionally I think there was one topic where they talked about Charles Wesley and who he was and kind of the founder of, the Methodist, denomination. So, they have things, but for me, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm also excited too, because it's like, well, if this is how they do things, years down the road, if I transition into a Church of God congregation, how can I implement some of the stuff I'm doing with confirmation as a way of discipleship to do more effective discipleship within a Church of God denomination? Because, a lot of times, a lot of Church of God churches, when I talk to them, number one struggle they have, how do we do discipleship? We just are having struggling with discipleship. It's like, okay, well, maybe I could help in that endeavors, because I was at a non-Church of God church that really focused on discipleship through confirmation. So I'm kind of excited about that portion as well with confirmation. But I think the other thing too is that the pastor is like basically my number one fan and like my biggest cheerleader. So she's very like, man, we can't wait for you to get here. It's excited. My team's very excited for me to get there. Um, Even just some of the other things, like they gave us a significant amount of moving expenses for us to be able to hire professional movers. So when we had the conversation, they're like, oh, did you find a professional mover? And I said, no, my dad has a big, gigantic trailer and a big truck. We're just going to load it up and just do that. So we won't have a lot of moving expenses. And then she's like, oh, so she goes, well, let me talk to our financial person and see if we can use that money that you're not using for moving expenses to help with paying rent for your wife while she's still in Virginia finishing up her student teaching.
Mm.
That statement was just like,
It's so validating.
yeah,
Like it's amazing to me, and I'm not hating on the Church of God. Please do not say
yeah,
it, but like it seems like all these experiences that I've had in other denominations, they're so much more like open to doing things differently in respect to finances and paying people, whether it's volunteers or staff or like an intern or things like that, where it's just amazing to me. Sorry, keep going.
well, and then even like that, like even like with salary, like, they said, okay, here's your salary. However, we're also going to give you X amount of money to cover your health insurance.
Mhm.
And the amount they gave, I'm thinking, there's no way I have ever spent that money on just premiums, yearly premiums in health insurance. So I actually, my meeting tomorrow, I have to talk, because they're like, oh, well, why don't we just take this money, just add it to part of your salary? So like, I don't even know what my salary is now, because we haven't really decided what we're doing. We do know that sometime at the beginning of the year, my dad's going to be kind of helping with trying to get us on an insurance plan that's going to help benefit everybody. Um, Especially since the pastor's husband's going to be retiring, so they would have to try to find insurance. So it's stuff like that where everybody's a team player, everyone's trying to figure out what's best. And again, it's just like the idea that everyone's, even before they said, hey, the attendants are moving out of the parsonage. However, they informed us that there is there's some fixed things that need to be fixed in the bathroom. So we're going to hold off on you moving in, because we have a company coming in right day. It says it's going to take 48 hours to do the work they need to do in the bathroom. So it's like stuff like that where I'm not moving into a house that's like first day. It's like, hey, the shower head shot off. So this is wrong. Like that was the other thing too. Like when I moved into the parsonage in Virginia, it was great, but there was a lot of problems. And I had to say, hey, this is leaking or this thing, and someone would come and fix it. But there'd be other times where it'd be weeks, or sometimes it wouldn't get fixed at all. So then I would have to fix it, or I'd have to call somebody to fix it because it wasn't getting done. And people go, well, And then occasionally people would begrudgingly thank me for doing stuff or fixing things. And it's like, but I asked you to do it. And it was 4 weeks. I didn't hear anything. Anytime I asked you, oh, yeah, we'll do it. And then they never did. So it's like I had to take matters in my own hand, because if not, then the water bill was going to be expensive and the church was paying the utilities at the time. It's like, I don't want it to be a financial burden on the church because you guys aren't coming to fix a leaky faucet or just replacing the faucet in general. So it's stuff like that where just the culture has been different to enough that sets a lot of the tension in the nerves that I have at ease, because it's like, man, these people really want me here. They really like me. They really believe in the vision and the mission that I have for this section of ministry that I'm going to be dealing with within the larger church body. And it just validates so many things. And especially for someone who's been in a ministry and went through a very bad go at it in ministry, just having that can really renew and refresh one's calling to ministry and going, this is great. So yeah, so that's wonderful. So I think that's kind of how we can kind of end things right there. I think, a lot of great transitions. And again, transitions have to be between the person who's coming in, but also the church has to embrace those transitions and really work together as a team to make those transitions as smooth as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But again, thank you for being on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to continue doing that new segment of yours if these churches go so well as we hope and dream. So,
and I was at the church when I found out about sologamy.
Yes, they're polyamorous.
They're polyamorous. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care.